In the quiet years just before America split in two, the country had a leader who watched the storm clouds gather, but did almost nothing to stop them. His name was James Buchanan, and he was the 15th President of the United States. He served from 1857 to 1861. Many historians today agree that his time in the White House made the country weaker and pushed it closer to civil war. Before becoming president, Buchanan had a long career in politics. He was born in 1791 in Pennsylvania and entered public service early in life. Over the years, he served as a congressman, a U.S. senator, and even as Secretary of State. He was also the U.S. ambassador to Russia and later to Great Britain. But all that experience didn't help him when he finally became president. Leading a country during a crisis takes more than just experience. It takes courage, clear vision, and the will to act. And Buchanan didn't show any of those things when the country needed them most. When Buchanan took office in 1857, the United States was already divided over slavery. The North wanted to stop slavery from spreading into new territories. The South wanted to keep slavery alive and even expand it. Tensions were rising fast. Many hoped Buchanan would bring the country together. Instead, he tried to stay neutral. He wanted peace between North and South so badly that he refused to take a strong stand. But sometimes not choosing a side is the same as picking the wrong one. Not long into Buchanan's presidency, the Supreme Court announced a shocking decision in the case of Dred Scott. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had lived for a time in free states and believed that made him a free man. He sued for his freedom, and the case reached the highest court in the land. In 1857, the court ruled against him. Even worse, the justices said that black people could never be U.S. citizens and that Congress had no power to stop slavery in any U.S. territory. People across the North were outraged. It was one of the worst decisions the court had ever made. It made it seem like slavery could spread everywhere. What did Buchanan do? Instead of standing up against the ruling, he supported it. In fact, it came out later that Buchanan may have talked to some of the judges before the decision to try to shape the outcome. That was highly inappropriate for a president, and his support of the court's decision made things even worse. Then came the trouble in Kansas. People there were trying to decide if the territory should allow slavery. Violence broke out between pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups. This period became known as Bleeding Kansas. A small group of pro-slavery settlers tried to force a constitution that would make Kansas a slave state. Many people in the territory said it was unfair and didn't represent them. Buchanan once again backed the wrong side. He supported the pro-slavery group and tried to pressure Congress to accept their version of the Kansas Constitution. Congress refused. Buchanan's actions made him look weak, biased, and out of touch. His support for slavery, whether intentional or not, caused deep anger in the North. At the same time, Southern leaders didn't fully trust him either. They didn't think he would protect slavery strongly enough if it came to a fight. Buchanan ended up isolated and powerless, without the support of either side. By the end of the 1850s, things were getting worse. People were talking about civil war. Then in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Lincoln wanted to stop the spread of slavery, but he didn't plan to end it where it already existed. Still, Southern states didn't trust him. They saw his election as a threat and began to leave the Union. Between December 1860 and March 1861, 7 Southern states, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas seceded from the United States. While all of this was happening, James Buchanan was still president. But instead of acting with strength, he froze. He said that states didn't have the right to secede, but also claimed that the federal government had no power to stop them. That left the country in limbo. A leader who should have stepped in and tried to calm the crisis chose instead to watch from the sidelines. The truth is, Buchanan didn't want to make enemies. He still hoped the South would return peacefully. But he had no plan, no action, and no strength. As the country slipped closer to war, he remained silent and passive. When his term finally ended in March 1861, the United States was already broken. When Buchanan handed power over to Lincoln, he told him, "If you are as happy entering the presidency as I am in leaving it, you are a very happy man." Lincoln didn't have time to enjoy the moment. Just weeks after taking office, the Civil War began. The South attacked Fort Sumter, and the bloodiest war in American history was underway. Buchanan returned to his home in Wheatland, Pennsylvania. He tried to defend himself in a book he wrote, saying the problems weren't his fault. But historians strongly disagree. His lack of leadership helped cause the very war he said he wanted to avoid. Instead of calming the nation, he fueled the fire by doing nothing. Even today, historians continue to rank James Buchanan as one of the worst presidents in U.S. history. His presidency was marked by indecision, poor judgment, and a failure to lead when it mattered most. He left the country weaker and more divided than when he entered office. But Buchanan's failure was just the beginning. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the nation had a new challenge: how to bring the country back together. That job fell to Andrew Johnson, who became president after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. But instead of healing the country, Johnson made many of the same mistakes as Buchanan, and in some ways he made even more dangerous ones. The Civil War had ended, but the wounds it left behind were deep. Cities in the South were burnt. Families across the country were grieving. For a million people who had lived their entire lives in slavery were now free, but they had no homes, no land, and few rights. America had survived the war, but now came the even harder part: rebuilding. That process was called Reconstruction, and it would test the strength of the country and the wisdom of its new president, Andrew Johnson. Johnson became the 17th President of the United States in April 1865, right after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. He had only been vice president for a few weeks before suddenly finding himself in charge of a wounded and divided nation. Johnson's time in office lasted from 1865 to 1869. It should have been a chance to help the country heal. Instead, it turned into a disaster. Andrew Johnson was born in 1808 in North Carolina and grew up very poor. He never went to school. In fact, he taught himself to read and write. As a young man, he became a tailor and later entered politics. He worked his way up, eventually becoming a U.S. Senator from Tennessee. When the Civil War started, Johnson remained loyal to the Union, even though he was from a southern state. That made him a rare figure, a Southerner who stayed with the North. When Lincoln ran for re-election in 1864, he picked Johnson as his running mate to show unity between North and South. But Lincoln likely never imagined that Johnson would soon be sitting in his chair. After Lincoln's death, Johnson took over as president. At first, many people hoped he would continue Lincoln's gentle but firm plan to bring the country back together. But those hopes quickly vanished. Johnson had strong beliefs about the Constitution, states' rights, and race, and many of those beliefs worked against the goals of Reconstruction. He believed that the Southern states should quickly be allowed to rejoin the Union with very few conditions. He didn't think they should be punished for starting the war. Most shocking of all, he didn't support giving full rights to newly freed Black Americans. As Southern states began to pass harsh black codes, laws that limited the freedom of black people, Johnson did almost nothing to stop them. These laws made it nearly impossible for freed people to vote, own property, or find good jobs. In some places, they were arrested just for being unemployed. It was slavery by another name, and Johnson let it happen. Congress, especially the radical Republicans, was furious. They wanted to rebuild the South in a way that protected the rights of former slaves. They passed laws to give Black Americans citizenship and civil rights. But Johnson vetoed these laws. He said it wasn't the federal government's job to interfere with the states. Again and again, Congress had to override his vetoes. In 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, the first federal law to declare that all people born in the U.S., except Native Americans, were citizens no matter their race. Johnson vetoed it. Congress overrode the veto. Later that year, lawmakers began working on what would become the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. It said that everyone born in the U.S. was a citizen and had equal protection under the law. Johnson opposed that too. More and more, Johnson was seen as a president who stood in the way of progress. Instead of helping former slaves become full members of society, he supported the old Southern leaders who had fought to keep slavery alive. He even granted pardons to many of them, allowing former Confederate leaders to return to power. His choices made it easier for racism and violence to grow in the South. Things got so bad between Johnson and Congress that they began to openly fight. In 1867, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, a law that said the president couldn't remove certain government officials without Senate approval. Johnson ignored it and fired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who had supported Reconstruction. That move led the House of Representatives to impeach Johnson, the first time in U.S. history that a president had been impeached. The impeachment trial moved to the Senate. The question was simple. Had Johnson broken the law, and should he be removed from office? The vote was incredibly close. In the end, Johnson survived removal by just one vote. He stayed in office, but his power was gone. Congress continued to pass laws and override his vetoes, and Johnson became more and more isolated. By the time the 1868 election rolled around, both major political parties had moved on. Johnson didn't win his party's nomination. He left office in 1869, bitter and unpopular. He returned to Tennessee, where he remained involved in politics, but his national influence was gone. The damage, however, was already done. Because of Johnson's resistance to real change, Reconstruction lost valuable time. Many of the freedoms that should have been given to Black Americans after the Civil War were delayed or denied. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan grew stronger during his presidency, and the chance to build a fairer country was lost for decades. Historians today look back at Andrew Johnson's time in office with deep disappointment. He had a moment in history where he could have helped transform America into a more equal nation. Instead, he chose to protect the old ways and ignore the cries for justice. His failure helped create a broken system in the South that would hurt millions of people for generations. After Johnson, the country tried to continue Reconstruction, but without a strong leader in the White House, the effort slowly fell apart. Racist laws and violence returned. And by the 1870s, many of the gains made during Reconstruction were rolled back. It would be nearly a century before civil rights would become a national priority again. But the story of bad presidents didn't stop with Johnson. Decades later, during one of the most corrupt times in American political history, another man would rise to power. His name was Warren G. Harding. And though he didn't face a civil war or lead a broken nation, he brought a different kind of disaster to the presidency, one filled with scandals, greed, and betrayal. As the dust of the Civil War and Reconstruction faded into memory, the United States moved forward into a new era. The country entered the 20th century with more cities, more industry, and more people chasing the American dream. But with growth came new problems. Big businesses gained too much power. Corruption crept into government. The rich grew richer while workers struggled. America needed leaders who could guide it with wisdom and strength. What it got instead in 1921 was Warren G. Harding, the 29th President of the United States. Harding's time in office was short, from 1921 to 1923. But his presidency is remembered for all the wrong reasons. While he looked the part of a strong, confident leader, his White House quickly became one of the most corrupt in American history. Harding was born in 1865 in Ohio. He worked as a newspaper publisher before entering politics. He served as a state senator, lieutenant governor, and later as a U.S. senator. Harding wasn't known for deep thinking or strong opinions. In fact, he was often described as vague, friendly, and easygoing. He looked good on stage, gave pleasant speeches, and avoided controversy. That made him a safe choice in the eyes of his party, but not necessarily a wise one. In 1920, Americans retired. World War I had just ended, and the Spanish flu pandemic had killed millions. People didn't want more change or more struggle. They wanted peace, quiet, and a return to normal life. Harding promised exactly that. His campaign slogan was "Return to Normalcy," and it worked. He won the presidency in a landslide. But once he took office in 1921, it quickly became clear that Harding was not prepared for the job. He didn't have clear goals or bold ideas. He didn't lead with energy or vision. Instead, he trusted the people around him to do most of the work. And that's where the real trouble began. Harding filled his cabinet with a mix of smart, capable men and friends who were anything but. This group of political allies, often called the Ohio Gang, included several men who used their positions for personal gain. Harding either didn't see what they were doing, or worse, didn't want to know. He once admitted, "I am not fit for this office and should never have been here." One of the most famous scandals in American history happened under Harding's watch, the Teapot Dome scandal. The name might sound strange, but the impact was serious. The U.S. government had set aside oil-rich lands for the Navy to use in emergencies. These oil reserves were meant to protect the country. But Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, secretly leased those oil lands to two private companies. In return, Fall received money, cattle, and gifts, bribes worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. At first, no one knew. But when the truth came out, it shocked the nation. Fall became the first cabinet member in U.S. history to go to prison for crimes committed while in office. The scandal was a symbol of how broken Harding's presidency had become. It wasn't just Teapot Dome. Other friends of Harding were caught stealing from the Veterans Bureau and misusing government funds. Corruption seemed to be everywhere. Harding didn't face criminal charges himself, but he was deeply embarrassed. As more and more scandals came to light, he began to lose confidence. He once told a friend, "My God, this is a hell of a job. I have no trouble with my enemies. But my friends, They're the ones that keep me walking the floor at night. Harding wasn't a man of evil intentions. He wasn't hateful or cruel, but he was careless. He didn't control the people under him. He didn't ask enough questions, and he didn't act fast enough when things went wrong. Being president isn't just about being liked. It's about being strong and making tough decisions. Harding failed to do that. In 1923, just 2 years into his presidency, Harding took a trip across the country to speak with Americans and try to rebuild trust. He called it the voyage of understanding. But during the trip, while in San Francisco, Harding suddenly became sick. On August 2nd, 1923, he died of a heart attack at age 57. His death shocked the country. At first, many people mourned him. They remembered his friendly personality and calm speeches. But as the months went on, the truth about the scandals in his administration became clearer. People began to see Harding's presidency for what it was: a time of wasted chances, shady deals, and weak leadership. Today, historians rank Harding near the bottom of presidential lists, not because he was evil or cruel, but because he allowed corruption to grow all around him. His failure wasn't one of war or racism. It was a failure of responsibility. He trusted the wrong people, avoided conflict, and didn't take control. The presidency is a serious job. Harding made it look like a club for friends. His story reminds us that being popular or well-liked doesn't make someone a good leader. America paid the price for his lack of judgment. And though Harding died before he could face the full consequences of his presidency, the damage had already been done. Unfortunately, Harding wouldn't be the last president to disappoint the country in a major way. Just a few years later, the United States would fall into the Great Depression, one of the worst economic disasters in its history. And during those first years of crisis, the man leading the country would be remembered not for solving the problem, but for standing by as millions suffered. His name was Herbert Hoover, and his presidency would go down as one of the most tragic examples of missed opportunity and stubborn pride. When Warren G. Harding died in 1923, the country was still booming. Businesses were growing fast, cars were filling the roads, and the stock market kept rising. People call the 1920s the Roaring Twenties, a time of jazz, parties, and new inventions. But underneath all the fun, something dangerous was building. Debt was rising, banks were weak, and too many people were investing money they didn't really have. Then, in 1929, everything came crashing down. The stock market collapsed, and the Great Depression began. Millions of Americans lost their jobs, their homes, and their savings. Businesses closed, banks failed, and families went hungry. In the middle of all this was the 31st President of the United States, Herbert Hoover. Hoover was born in 1874 in Iowa. He was a smart and hard-working man who became rich as a mining engineer. During World War I, he helped organize food relief for starving people in Europe. That work made him famous, and people saw him as a caring, capable leader. He served as Secretary of Commerce under Presidents Harding and Coolidge. In 1928, the Republican Party picked him to run for president. He won easily, with people believing he would bring continued success. Hoover took office in March 1929. At first, the economy seemed fine, but just months later, in October, the stock market crashed. Prices of stocks fell fast and hard. People panicked. Banks began to fail. It was the beginning of the worst economic crisis in U.S. history. At first, Hoover believed the economy would fix itself. He thought if the government stayed out of the way, businesses would recover. He told Americans to stay hopeful and work hard. He said, "Prosperity is just around the corner." But as time passed, things only got worse. By 1930, unemployment had soared. People who once had steady jobs were now standing in long lines for food. Families lived in tents and shacks. Some even moved into parks and empty lots. These makeshift towns became known as Hoovervilles, a sign of just how much people blamed the president. Hoover didn't ignore the crisis, but the steps he took were small and slow. He supported loans to banks and businesses, hoping the money would trickle down to workers. But it didn't. The help stayed at the top. People on the streets needed jobs, food, and shelter. But Hoover refused to give direct aid. He believed that giving people government help would make them weak and dependent. He saw it as a threat to American values of hard work and self-reliance. One of the most heartbreaking moments of Hoover's presidency happened in 1932. Thousands of World War I veterans marched to Washington, D.C. to ask for early payment of a bonus they had been promised. These men were hungry, jobless, and desperate. They built a camp near the Capitol and waited peacefully. Hoover, afraid they might turn violent, ordered the U.S. Army to remove them. The Army, led by General Douglas MacArthur, used tear gas and burned their camp to the ground. People across the country were shocked. Images of veterans being attacked by soldiers hurt Hoover's reputation even more. To many Americans, he no longer seemed like a hero. He seemed heartless. By 1932, the country was in deep pain. 1 in 4 workers was unemployed. Banks had failed by the thousands. Farmers were losing their land. The Depression touched every home. People had lost faith in the government and in Herbert Hoover. In the 1932 election, Hoover ran for a second term, but he was no match for his opponent, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt promised a New Deal and hope for a better future. He won in a landslide. Hoover left office in March 1933 with some of the lowest approval ratings in history. After his presidency, Hoover continued to write and speak. In time, he regained some respect, especially for his later work helping government reform. But the stain of his presidency during the Great Depression never faded. Historians now agree that Hoover had good intentions, but his beliefs about government held him back. He didn't understand how deep the crisis had become. He thought old ideas about business and personal responsibility would fix everything. But the Depression needed bold, new solutions. Hoover didn't deliver them. His failure taught the country a lesson. During great emergencies, leaders must act boldly, not just hope for the best. And while Hoover's presidency was marked by inaction and missed chances decades later, America would face a different kind of crisis. Not economic, but political. In the 1970s, the country would once again lose trust in its leader, not because of poverty or war, but because of lies, cover-ups, and the abuse of power. That president was Richard Nixon, and his fall would shake the very foundation of American democracy. After the pain of the Great Depression and the storm of World War II, the United States entered a new era. It was a time of Cold War fears, fast-moving changes in technology, and major fights for civil rights. By the late 1960s, the country was struggling. There were protests against the Vietnam War, cities shaken by riots, and deep divisions between Americans. People wanted law, order, and leadership they could trust. That's when Richard Nixon stepped in. Nixon had been around politics for a long time. He was born in 1913 in California and grew up poor. He worked hard, went to law school, and served in World War II. He became a U.S. congressman, then a senator, and later vice president under Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s. He lost the presidential election to John F. Kennedy in 1960, then lost a race for governor of California in 1962. Most people thought his career was over, but Nixon made a comeback. In 1968, running as a Republican, he won the presidency. He promised to restore order, end the war in Vietnam, and bring the country together. In many ways, Nixon was smart, tough, and skilled. He opened relations with China and signed major agreements with the Soviet Union to limit nuclear weapons. He also started environmental programs and supported civil rights laws. For a time, he was popular and powerful. But underneath all that, something darker was growing. Nixon believed deeply in control and secrecy. He didn't trust the press. He didn't trust Congress. He didn't even trust many people in his own government. He surrounded himself with loyal aides who did whatever it took to protect him, even when it meant crossing the line. And that line was crossed in a scandal that became known simply as Watergate. It all began in 1972. That year, Nixon was running for re-election. One night, 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic Party's headquarters at the Watergate office building in Washington, D.C. They were trying to wiretap phones and steal documents. At first, it seemed like a simple break-in. But reporters from the Washington Post, especially Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, began to dig deeper. What they found shocked the nation. The burglars were linked to Nixon's re-election campaign. Money had been used to fund spying, secret operations, and efforts to damage Nixon's political enemies. Worse, people in the White House were trying to cover it all up. They lied to investigators, destroyed evidence, and paid hush money to keep people quiet. At first, Nixon said he had nothing to do with it. He called the investigation a witch hunt and said the media was out to get him. But slowly, the truth came out. In 1973, former aides began to testify in court. They admitted the White House had created an enemies list and had tried to use government agencies to go after political opponents. Then came the biggest bombshell of all. It was revealed that Nixon had secretly recorded all conversations in the Oval Office. Everything he said and everything others said to him was on tape. Congress demanded the tapes. Nixon refused. The battle went all the way to the Supreme Court. In 1974, the court ruled that Nixon had to turn the tapes over. When the tapes were finally released, they showed that Nixon had been involved in the cover-up almost from start. On one tape, just days after the break-in, Nixon talked about using the CIA to stop the FBI from investigating. It was clear. The president had abused his power. The House of Representatives prepared articles of impeachment, accusing Nixon of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. But before they could vote, Nixon made a choice. On August 8, 1974, Nixon went on television and announced that he would resign. "I have never been a quitter," he said, "but as president, I must put the interest of America first." The next day, he left the White House. His vice president, Gerald Ford, became president and later gave Nixon a full pardon, sparking more anger across the country. It was the first and only time in U.S. history that a president resigned. The damage Nixon caused went far beyond one break-in. He had built a system of lies and power games inside the White House. He had turned the presidency into something secretive and dangerous. Americans had trusted him, and he had betrayed that trust. After Watergate, many people lost faith in the government. New laws were passed to make sure no president could ever have that kind of power again. Historians agree that Nixon was one of the smartest presidents in history, but also one of the most deeply flawed. He was skilled at foreign policy, but obsessed with control. His downfall wasn't caused by war or the economy. It came from pride, fear, and the belief that the rules didn't apply to him. Watergate taught America a hard lesson. Even the most powerful leader must follow the law. Still, as time passed, the country moved on. And in the decades to come, more presidents would rise and fall. Some would lead with strength, others with weakness. But in the early 2000s, after national tragedy shook the country to its core, a new leader stepped in, one who promised clarity and strength. His name was George W. Bush. And while he didn't lie about tapes or hide a break-in, the decisions he made would lead America into war, confusion, and one of the most controversial chapters in modern history. The early 2000s began with shock, fear, and fire. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, terrorists hijacked airplanes and attacked the United States. 2 planes hit the Twin Towers in New York City. Another hit the Pentagon. A 4th crashed in a Pennsylvania field. Nearly 3,000 people died. The country was heartbroken. People gathered in silence, waved flags, and looked to their president for guidance. That president was George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the United States. He had taken office just months earlier, in January 2001. He had won one of the closest and most controversial elections in U.S. history, defeating Vice President Al Gore after a long court battle over Florida's votes. Some Americans questioned his victory, but after September 11th, most put politics aside and hoped for strong leadership. For a short time, Bush delivered just that. He stood at Ground Zero in New York and shouted into a megaphone, promising justice. He gave speeches that comforted the nation. His approval ratings soared. People wanted action, and Bush promised it. Soon after the attacks, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan to destroy al-Qaeda, the terrorist group behind 9/11, and remove the Taliban government that protected them. At first, the mission seemed successful. American forces pushed the Taliban out of power, and plans began for a new Afghan government. But Afghanistan would prove to be a long and difficult war. Still, that wasn't the most controversial part of Bush's presidency. That came with Iraq. In 2003, just 2 years after September 11th, President Bush announced that Iraq, led by dictator Saddam Hussein, had weapons of mass destruction, WMDs as they were called. These included chemical, biological, and possibly even nuclear weapons. Bush and his advisors warned that Saddam could give these weapons to terrorists. They said Iraq was a threat to the U.S. and the world. But there was a problem. The evidence was thin. Some intelligence reports were shaky. Others were wrong. Still, the Bush administration pushed forward. They said they couldn't wait for a possible attack. They had to strike first. Many countries, including key allies, questioned the plan. But in March 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq. The war began with shock and awe, bombs lighting up the night sky over Baghdad. At first, it seemed like a quick win. Saddam Hussein's government collapsed. He was captured and later executed. Bush gave a speech on an aircraft carrier with a banner behind him that read "Mission Accomplished." But the mission was far from over. After Saddam's fall, Iraq fell into chaos. There was no clear plan for what came next. American troops stayed to try to build a new government, but violence spread. Militias and terrorist groups grew. Civil war broke out between Sunni and Shia Muslims. Thousands of Iraqi civilians died. American soldiers kept dying, too. And those weapons of mass destruction? They were never found. The reason given for going to war, WMDs, was proven false. Many Americans felt betrayed. They believed the war had been built on lies, or at the very least, serious mistakes. The cost of the war was enormous. Over 4,000 American troops killed, tens of thousands wounded, and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives lost. The U.S. spent trillions of dollars on a war that created more problems than it solved. At home, Bush's popularity dropped sharply. People who had once supported him began to question everything. Why were American troops still dying? Why weren't we fixing things? And how did our leaders get it so wrong? But the war wasn't Bush's only problem. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans and much of the Gulf Coast. The storm broke levees, flooded entire neighborhoods, and left thousands stranded. Over 1,800 people died. The government's response was slow and poorly managed. For days, Americans watched people begging for help on live TV, while officials argued over what to do. Bush visited the disaster area days later, but the damage to both the city and his reputation was already done. Many said the government's weak response showed that Bush didn't understand or care about the struggles of poor and black Americans. His famous line, "Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job," to the head of FEMA, the agency in charge of disaster relief, became a symbol of failure. By the time Bush left office in 2009, the U.S. was also facing a massive financial crisis. Banks were collapsing, people were losing their homes, and unemployment was rising fast. The economy was in free fall. Bush's last months in office were spent trying to stop the collapse, but it was too late. The Great Recession had begun. To be fair, not all of Bush's time in office was negative. He supported AIDS relief in Africa and increased funding for education. But his presidency is most remembered for two wars, a failed hurricane response, and an economic crash. Historians debate whether Bush was dishonest or simply misled by bad advice. But one thing is clear. The decisions made during his presidency caused deep, lasting harm. The Iraq War destabilized the Middle East and led to years of violence. The failure to act quickly after Katrina damaged trust in government. And the economic crisis hurt millions of families. It was a presidency shaped by disaster and made worse by choices that many believe were wrong. But even after Bush, controversy and failure didn't leave the White House for long. In 2016, a new leader came into office. Not a general, senator, or a career politician, but a businessman and TV personality named Donald Trump. His presidency would divide the country like no other, filled with anger, chaos, and claims of fake news. For many, it was a 4-year storm of confusion and conflict. When Donald Trump won the presidential election in 2016, the world watched in shock. He had never served in government or the military. He was best known for running real estate businesses, hosting a reality TV show, and making headlines for his bold and often offensive statements. But on November 8, 2016, Trump defeated former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and became the 45th President of the United States. He took office in January 2017, promising to drain the swamp in Washington, put America first, and shake up the political system. For some Americans, Trump's win felt like a revolution. For others, it felt like a warning. From the very beginning, Trump's presidency was different. He used Twitter like a weapon, firing off insults at political opponents, celebrities, journalists, and even foreign leaders. He often repeated false claims, promoted conspiracy theories, and called the media the enemy of the people. His words didn't just shock, they stirred anger and division across the country. One of Trump's early acts was to ban travelers from several Muslim-majority countries. He called it necessary for national security. Critics called it racist and unconstitutional. The courts got involved, and after several changes, the ban was allowed in a limited form. But the message was clear. Trump was going to rule with force and low patience for pushback. Throughout his time in office, Trump faced many controversies. He was accused of trying to block investigations into his campaign's connections with Russia. Special counsel Robert Mueller led a 2-year probe. The final report didn't say Trump was guilty of a crime, but it also didn't clear him. It said there was substantial evidence of obstruction of justice, and that Congress could decide what to do. And Congress did act twice. In 2019, Trump became only the 3rd president in U.S. history to be impeached. The charge? He had pressured Ukraine's leader to dig up dirt on his political rival, Joe Biden, while withholding military aid. The House of Representatives voted to impeach him, but the Senate, controlled by his party, voted not to remove him. A year later, something even bigger shook the world: the COVID-19 pandemic. In early 2020, the virus began spreading. People got sick. Hospitals filled up. Countries shut down. In this crisis, America looked again to its president. But Trump downplayed the virus, called it a hoax, and suggested unproven treatments. He refused to wear a mask for months. As the death toll rose, his approval ratings fell. Scientists begged for serious action, but Trump often argued with his own health experts. By the end of his term, over 400,000 Americans had died from COVID-19. In the middle of the pandemic, Trump also faced nationwide protests after the killing of George Floyd, a black man who died under a police officer's knee. The country erupted in calls for justice and an end to racism. Trump's response was not to calm the anger, but to threaten protesters with force. When peaceful demonstrators gathered near the White House, they were tear-gassed so Trump could pose with a Bible in front of church. The image, instead of showing strength, deepened the divide. Trump's second impeachment came in his final days as president. In November 2020, Trump lost the election to Joe Biden, but he refused to accept it. He claimed, without proof, that the election was stolen. He filed dozens of lawsuits, all of which failed. He pressured officials to find votes and overturn results. He told his followers to fight like hell. Then, on January 6, 2021, a violent mob stormed the U.S. Capitol while Congress was certifying Biden's win. The attackers broke windows, smashed doors, and chanted about killing lawmakers. They carried flags with Trump's name and wore shirts with extremist symbols. 5 people died. Many more were injured. The world watched in horror. Trump waited hours before telling the rioters to go home. Even then, he told them, "We love you. You're very special." After the attack, the House of Representatives impeached him again, this time for inciting an insurrection. The Senate held a trial after he left office. He was acquitted again, but this time, 7 Republican senators voted against him. By the end of his presidency, Trump had left the country more divided than it had been in generations. His supporters praised him for being bold and different. But critics and most historians say his time in office weakened democracy, damaged global trust, and led to the first violent attack on the Capitol in more than 200 years. Trump was the first president to be impeached twice, the first to spread false claims about an election he lost, and the first to leave office under the shadow of an attempted coup. His impact will be debated for years, but most experts agree. His presidency was marked by chaos, division, and a deep distrust in the truth. America survived it, but not without scars. And so, across more than 2 centuries of American history, these 7 leaders, James Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, Warren G. Harding, Herbert Hoover, Richard Nixon, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump, each left a legacy of failure in their own way. Some failed through silence, others through action. Some let the country fall apart. Others tore it apart themselves. But in each case, the lesson remains the same. The presidency is not just a title. It is a test of judgment, courage, and responsibility. And when the wrong person is given that trust, the damage can last for generations. Let us not forget, so we do not repeat.